Simple question. Do you want to take the best photos possible? It may shock you that you could be leaving the best photos possible on the table, or in this case, on your computer. In this video, we're going to be looking at the biggest beginner photography mistake in Lightroom so that you don't make it and you can create the best photos possible coming up. So we're looking at this photo here in this video, lots of contrast going on, just a beautiful morning, nice side light on some cypress trees in a swamp. But here's the problem with this. There's a lot of different light going on. There's shadows, there's highlights, there's whites and blacks. How do you know how to mix all these up? Well, the actual biggest mistake I see people make is just blasting the contrast all the way up on their contrast slider. Why that's a huge mistake is you can see that it turns the photo into an unrealistic expectation. You see that the shadows and the highlights right next to each other are so far apart that it's totally unrealistic than anything you would ever see in your life in person. To understand this completely, I'm going to show you how contrast impacts your photos, and then I'm going to be showing you a beginner, an advanced, and a pro version of how you can fix this problem so that you can create the best photos possible. So let's look at contrast overall. If you look at the histogram up in the top right corner of your screen, if I pull contrast all the way up to 100 to an exaggerated state, you see that it stretches that histogram right across the screen. What it's doing is it's putting more data and pixels in the highlights and the shadows to stretch out that data information in your image file, thus creating more data in the highlights, more data in the shadows. That creates unrealistic photos. While it is important to create contrast in your photos, it's not always important to stretch the histogram as far as possible as you can, and that's what the contrast slider ultimately does. So while you can increase this a little bit, you need to keep in mind that there are other ways that you can actually impact the overall photo using your contrast. Now, beginners always just slide up the contrast and don't really worry about anything else. Let's look at the beginner version of how to fix this problem and create the best light in your post-processing for your photography. So looking at this, first I want to tackle the overall temperature of the photo. I think it looks pretty good here. I may add just a touch more of magenta into the scene, and then I'm going to play around with the exposure just a little bit, increasing it a little bit more. So with the contrast, I do want to slide that up just a little bit for my photo here and try to get that dialed in where I want it to be. Now, the beginner fix is just sliding that contrast up, but to keep it intact and to keep it constrained so that it's not ruining your photo, what you need to do is hit the J key on your keyboard. What that does is it engages the clipping on your histogram. So if I zoom in here to the brightest parts, you see this red highlight start to show up. That's telling me that this is clipping that section of this photo and ultimately erasing any data in those pixels so that it can't be altered later. So what I can do to fix this is come down to my whites and just pull my whites down enough so that that highlight goes away, and I can zoom in on other parts of the photo and they're ultimately gone now that I fixed the brightest part of that photo. So that's the beginner trick. Getting to more of an advanced way to fix this, what I can do is, yes, increase the contrast, but I also move down to my highlights and shadows section down in the bottom section below that. So I can increase my contrast just a little bit, nothing like we did before when we only did the contrast. But what I'm gonna do now is increase my highlights to further that contrast. And if you see, I still have that J key selected. When I do the highlights all the way up, that's going to show that I am starting to clip there. So I'm gonna bring that down just a little bit. Now the highlights and the shadows section is going to be way more subtle than just pulling up the contrast slider all the way. That's why I always opt for going down below the contrast slider and working with my highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. So if I pull up my highlights just a little bit and then drop my shadows just a little bit, it makes those contrast points so much more subtle and creates a much better result, very much like you would see in the field when you're going out to photograph this. Now in just a second, I'm going to show you the pro level fix for fixing your contrast in your photos and creating the best photos possible. But first I want to tell you about a free landscape photography masterclass that's streaming right now that you can access whenever you need. It's linked down below in the video description and in the pinned comment. That's going to show you how to get the best exposure in your photography without even knowing manual mode, how to get the best compositions no matter what kind of camera that you have. And number 3, how to create the best photos no matter where you are in the entire world. Again, that's linked below in the video description for you to check out. So here's the pro level fix to this. It really capitalizes on subtlety in the light and the shadows and maximizes the depth of your contrast without overblowing it into an unrealistic realm. So if I do scroll up on my contrast just a little bit, just to about 7, I'm gonna keep it there. Now, unlike we did in the advanced section, I'm actually gonna do the opposite with my highlights and my shadows. And this may seem a little bit weird to you, but hang with me because I'm gonna show you exactly why. So if I actually drop my highlights and increase my shadows, what that's doing is it's not altering the histogram too much, but it's making a much more level scene throughout. That's much more realistic to what you would see with your own 2 eyes, but the ultimate hack is what comes in the next step. So now we have a pretty level photo throughout, but I'm gonna add depth to my contrast by now increasing my whites and decreasing my blacks, thus creating even more contrast within the scene. So the whites and the blacks are only very localized specific adjustments that increase the brightness of those whites and decrease the darkness of those blacks. So you're getting much more subtle differences in the contrast, and you're able to manipulate the histogram and the data in your file without overblowing it into an unrealistic photo. So again, what I can do is tweak this once I get it up there, because you'll see a lot of blues coming in. So I'm just gonna increase my yellow in the temperature and bring that back to normal. And then I can scroll down to actually some of my blue in here. Click my color dropper, come to blue, and I'm gonna drop my saturation on my blue. And now we have a much more subtle and correctly composed photo with the contrast in your post-processing. If you want much more information on how to process your photos using Lightroom, click or tap this playlist showing up on your screen right now.